Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey that will completely shatter everything you think you know about medieval food. Picture this. You're watching Game of Thrones, and there's Tyrion Lannister gnawing on a massive turkey leg at some grand feast. Or maybe you've seen Robin Hood, where everyone's constantly munching on chunks of roasted meat and drinking from enormous goblets. Well, I hate to break it to you, but if you travelled back to actual medieval times expecting to eat like that, you'd probably starve to death within a week. The truth about what medieval people really ate is so shocking, so different from what Hollywood has fed us, that it will literally change how you see history forever. Now, before we dive into this mind-blowing journey together, I need a tiny favour from you. If you're someone who loves discovering the hidden truths behind history's greatest mysteries, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. And if this story ends up surprising you as much as I think it will, show some love with a like. Oh, and I'm genuinely curious. Are you watching this tucked into bed? Maybe with some late night snacks nearby? Drop a comment and tell me what you're munching on right now, because trust me, after tonight's story, you'll never look at your food the same way again. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time together. So here's the thing that absolutely blew my mind when I first discovered it. When most of us think about medieval times, our brains immediately go to those epic movie scenes. You know the ones. Massive wooden tables groaning under the weight of whole roasted pigs. Nobles tearing into enormous drumsticks, wine flowing like water. It's this image of constant feasting and abundance that Hollywood has drilled into our heads for decades. But here's what actually happened when historians started digging deeper into medieval records, account books, and archaeological evidence. They found something that would make your jaw drop. The average medieval person, and we're talking about roughly 90% of the population, ate less meat in an entire year than the average American consumes in a single month. Think about that for a second. Let that sink in. I remember when I first read this statistic in a research paper from Cambridge University, I had to read it 3 times because I simply couldn't believe it. We're talking about people who might see meat on their plate maybe a dozen times per year, and usually just tiny portions during special religious holidays or celebrations. Now you might be wondering, but wait, didn't medieval people hunt? Weren't there animals everywhere? And that's exactly the kind of logical thinking that gets us into trouble when we try to understand the past through our modern lens. See, here's something most people don't realise. Hunting wasn't some free-for-all activity where peasants could just grab a bow and arrow and go catch dinner. Hunting was actually one of the most strictly controlled activities in medieval society. The forests, the deer, even the rabbits, they all belonged to the nobles. If you were caught poaching, and by poaching I mean trying to feed your starving family, you could face punishments that would make modern prison sentences look like a vacation. We're talking about having your hands cut off, being branded, or even hanged. There are actual court records from medieval England showing peasants being executed for killing a single rabbit. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and this is something that really shows how different their world was from ours. Even the wealthy nobles, the ones who supposedly lived these lives of luxury and abundance, their diets would shock you. A study of noble household accounts from the 14th century revealed that even the richest families ate meat only about 3 or 4 times per week. And when they did eat meat, it wasn't these massive portions we see in movies. I came across this fascinating account book from an English nobleman's household in 1347, and it detailed every single meal served over an entire year. You know what the most common meat was? Not beef. Not pork, not venison from grand hunting expeditions. It was, wait for it, pigeons. Yep, pigeons. These wealthy people were eating birds that we now consider city pests. And here's something that'll really bake your noodle. Those famous medieval turkey legs that are basically the symbol of medieval feasting. Turkeys didn't even exist in Europe during the Middle Ages. They're native to the Americas and weren't brought to Europe until after Columbus. So every time you see someone in a medieval movie chomping down on a turkey leg, you're essentially watching a historical impossibility. The more I dug into this research, the more I realised that our entire perception of medieval food culture has been shaped by literally centuries of romanticised storytelling. The image of the medieval feast comes largely from much later periods, when writers and artists were looking back at the good old days through rose-coloured glasses, creating this fantasy of abundance that never really existed for most people. But here's what's really fascinating about all this. And this is where the story gets personal and kind of heartbreaking. The reason Hollywood's version of medieval eating is so appealing to us isn't just because it looks dramatic on screen. It's because it represents something we deeply crave as human beings. This idea of a simpler time when food was natural, when people sat together for massive communal meals, when eating was this joyful, abundant experience. The reality is that for most medieval people, food wasn't about pleasure or abundance or even basic satisfaction. It was about survival, and that survival was constantly hanging by a thread, dependent on weather, war, disease, and the whims of people in power. Now, I don't want you to think this is going to be a depressing story about starvation and suffering, because the truth about medieval food is actually far more complex, surprising, and fascinating than either the Hollywood fantasy or the grim reality I've just described. Medieval people developed some of the most ingenious, creative, and yes, even delicious ways of eating that would absolutely amaze you today. They created flavour combinations that would make modern fusion restaurants jealous. They invented preservation techniques that we still use. They threw parties and celebrations around food that would put our modern dinner parties to shame. And they developed a relationship with their meals that was so intimate, so connected to the seasons and the earth and their communities, that most of us have completely lost touch with it. But before we explore those incredible innovations and discoveries, we need to understand exactly what was actually on the plates of ordinary medieval people. Because once you know what 90% of the population was really eating day after day, year after year, you'll understand why the few moments of abundance and celebration around food were so precious, so meaningful, and so worth preserving in stories and songs. And trust me, when you discover what these resourceful, resilient people managed to create from the simplest, humblest ingredients, you'll never look at your own kitchen the same way again. So now that we've shattered those Hollywood illusions, let me paint you a picture of what actually filled the belly of a typical medieval peasant. And I promise you, this is going to be one of those moments where you'll either be incredibly grateful for your modern life, or maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself oddly envious of something these people had that we've completely lost. Picture this. It's dawn in a small English village in the year 1348. A peasant named Thomas, and yes, Thomas was actually one of the most common names according to parish records from that era, wakes up in his tiny one-room cottage. The first thing he does isn't check his phone or grab a cup of coffee. Instead, he reaches for a wooden bowl and fills it with something that would be his breakfast, lunch, and probably dinner too. Something called pottage. Now, before you start imagining some exotic medieval dish, let me tell you what pottage actually was. It was basically porridge. But not the nice creamy oatmeal you might have this morning. We're talking about a thick greyish mixture of whatever grains Thomas could get his hands on, usually barley, oats or rye, boiled with water, and maybe, if he was incredibly lucky, a tiny bit of milk or some vegetables from his small garden. Dr. Christopher Dyer, one of the leading medieval historians at the University of Leicester, spent years analysing household account books and agricultural records from medieval England. His research revealed something that would shock most of us today. The average peasant consumed between 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day. But here's the kicker. About 80% of those calories came from grain. Just grain. Day after day, year after year. But here's where this story gets really interesting, and trust me, this detail is going to stick with you long after this video ends. That bowl of pottage wasn't just Thomas's meal, it was literally his lifeline. Because medieval peasants had developed this incredible system where they would keep a pot of pottage continuously cooking over their fire. They'd add new ingredients throughout the day, maybe some cabbage leaves, perhaps an onion if they had one, occasionally a bit of bacon if it was a feast day. Bridget Ann Hennish, in her groundbreaking book Fast and Feast Food in Medieval Society, describes how some pottage pots were kept going for weeks, even months. Can you imagine that? The same pot continuously bubbling, being added to and eaten from day after day. It's like the medieval equivalent of a slow cooker that never gets turned off. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds absolutely disgusting, right? But here's something that completely changed my perspective when I learned about it. Food historians who have actually recreated these medieval pottage recipes, and yes, there are people dedicated enough to do this, discovered something remarkable. When made with the right combination of grains and whatever vegetables were available, pottage was actually nutritionally pretty solid. Not exciting, not Instagram worthy, but it kept people alive and functioning. But let's talk about bread for a moment, because this is where the medieval food story gets really wild. You see, bread wasn't just food for medieval people. It was literally currency, status symbol, and sometimes even a weapon all rolled into one. According to the extensive records kept by medieval guilds, there were dozens of different types of bread, and what you ate depended entirely on your social class. The whitest, finest bread made from pure wheat flour, that was called manchet, and it was so expensive that only the wealthy could afford it. We're talking about bread that cost the equivalent of what a modern artisan's sourdough might cost today. Except imagine if that was the cheapest bread available to rich people. The bread that peasants like our friend Thomas ate was called maslin, a dark, dense loaf made from whatever grains were available. Barley, rye, oats, sometimes even ground peas or beans mixed in. Food historian Maguilon Toussaint-Samar notes in her comprehensive study, A History of Food, that this peasant bread was so dark and heavy that wealthy people literally couldn't digest it properly if they tried to eat it. Their stomachs, accustomed to refined foods, would rebel against the coarse, fibre-rich peasant bread. But here's what's absolutely fascinating, and this is one of those details that shows how different their world was from ours. Medieval bakers weren't just business people selling bread. They were essentially public servants whose work could determine whether entire communities lived or died. The price and weight of bread was so strictly regulated that bakers who cheated customers could face punishments ranging from hefty fines to being dragged through the streets in a cart with the offending loaf hung around their neck. There are actual court records from medieval London showing bakers being prosecuted for making loaves that were even an ounce underweight. The assize of bread, established in England in the 13th century, created a complex system where the price of bread was tied directly to the price of grain, and bakers' profits were essentially fixed by law. Now let's talk about the liquid that accompanied all these meals, because this is where medieval life gets really interesting. You know how we start our day with coffee, maybe have some juice, definitely drink water throughout the day. Well, medieval people started their day with ale. Yes, ale at breakfast, and they drank it all day long. But before you start thinking medieval people were just walking around drunk all the time, let me explain something that completely changed how I understood medieval life. The ale that people drank daily was called small ale or table ale, and it had an alcohol content of only about 2–3%. Compare that to modern beer, which is usually 4–6% alcohol. Medieval daily ale was basically like drinking a very mild beer. Dr. Richard Unger, who wrote the definitive work Beer in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, explains that ale wasn't just a beverage choice, it was often the safest thing to drink. The brewing process, even the simple version used for daily ale, killed harmful bacteria that might be lurking in water sources. In medieval cities especially, where sanitation was, let's just say, challenging, ale was literally safer than water. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Children drank ale too. Medieval children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, would have small ale with their meals. There are household account books from noble families showing purchases of special children's ale with even lower alcohol content. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern parent. But perhaps the most touching part of this story, the part that really gets to me, is how medieval families approach mealtime. Despite having so little, despite the constant uncertainty about where the next meal would come from, they developed rituals around food that were deeply meaningful. Every meal, no matter how simple, began with a prayer. Not just a quick "bless this food," but often elaborate prayers of gratitude that could last several minutes. Medieval families understood something that we've largely forgotten, that having enough food to eat was never guaranteed, and therefore every meal was literally a blessing. Alice de Bruyne, a 14th century English noblewoman, kept detailed household records that survive to this day. These records show that even in wealthy households, nothing was wasted. Leftover bread became breadcrumbs for cooking. Vegetable scraps went to feed animals. Even the water used to wash dishes was often reused for cooking the next day. Think about that the next time you scrape half a meal into the garbage without thinking twice about it. These people had developed a relationship with food that was so respectful, so mindful, that waste was literally unthinkable. But here's what I find most remarkable about medieval peasant meals. Despite the monotony, despite the limited ingredients, these people somehow managed to create community and joy around their simple food. Village feast days, harvest celebrations, wedding meals. Even the poorest communities would pool their resources to create something special. Everyone would contribute what they could. One family might provide grain, another some vegetables. Maybe someone had saved up enough to contribute a chicken. As I've been researching this topic, I keep coming back to one question. Have we, with all our abundance and choices, actually lost something essential about the way we relate to food? When was the last time you felt genuine gratitude for a simple meal? When did you last share food with neighbours in a way that strengthened your community? But speaking of medieval creativity with simple ingredients, you haven't heard anything yet. Because when we start exploring how these resourceful people transformed their basic grains into something that was not just edible, but actually delicious, well, that's when the real magic of medieval cooking begins to reveal itself. And it starts with understanding something that was far more precious than gold in the medieval world. That precious commodity I mentioned. It wasn't gold, silver, or even land. It was something you probably have sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now. Something so common that you've never given it a second thought. But in medieval times, this simple ingredient was literally worth more than a human life. I'm talking about bread, but not just any bread. I'm talking about the complex, fascinating, and sometimes deadly world of medieval bread that determined everything from your social status to your chances of survival. Let me tell you a story that perfectly captures just how serious bread was in the medieval world. In 1266, there was a baker in London named John le Boulanger, and yes, his last name literally meant the baker, who was caught selling loaves that were 2 ounces underweight. Now you might think, 2 ounces? That's nothing. But John was sentenced to be dragged through the streets of London on a hurdle. which is basically a wooden frame with the offending loaf of bread tied around his neck, while the town crier announced his crime to everyone. This wasn't some extreme punishment from a crazy judge. This was standard procedure, documented in the official records of the City of London. Dr. Martha Carlin, who spent decades studying medieval London court records, found hundreds of similar cases where bakers faced public humiliation, heavy fines, or even imprisonment for bread-related crimes. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Bread wasn't just food, it was literally a form of currency and social identification all rolled into one. When medieval people looked at your bread, they could immediately tell everything about your place in society, your wealth, your connections, and even your moral character. At the very top of the bread hierarchy was something called manchet, or pain de main, the whitest, finest bread made from pure wheat flour that had been sifted multiple times through the finest cloth. According to food historian Terence Scully's research in the art of cookery in the Middle Ages, this bread was so white it was almost luminous, achieved by sifting the flour through cloth so fine that it took an entire day to produce enough flour for just a few loaves. Here's something that'll blow your mind. This white bread was so associated with purity and godliness that it was literally called God's bread in some regions. Medieval people believed that the whiter your bread, the closer you were to divine perfection. Nobles would sometimes gift white bread to churches as a form of religious offering. But here's where it gets really wild, and this is something that completely changed how I understood medieval society. The Catholic Church actually developed an entire theology around bread whiteness. They taught that just as white bread was more refined and pure than dark bread, the souls of the wealthy were naturally more refined and closer to God than those of peasants who ate dark bread. Thomas Aquinas himself, the great medieval theologian, wrote extensively about how the foods people ate reflected their spiritual state. In his Summa Theologica, he argued that those who could afford refined white foods were demonstrating God's favour, while those who ate coarse, dark foods were showing their need for spiritual refinement. Can you imagine living in a world where your breakfast literally determined your moral worth in the eyes of society, where the colour of your bread was seen as evidence of your relationship with God? Now let's talk about what the majority of people actually ate. Remember our peasant friend Thomas. His bread was called maslin, and it was a completely different universe from that divine white manchet. Maslin was made from whatever grains were available, usually a mixture of wheat, rye, barley and oats. Sometimes, when times were really tough, it included ground peas, beans, or even acorns. Food historian C. Ann Wilson, in her comprehensive study Food and Drink in Britain, discovered through analysis of medieval household accounts that maslin bread was so dense and heavy that it had to be baked in massive loaves, weighing up to 8 pounds each. These loaves were then cut into portions that would last a family for several days. But here's something fascinating that most people don't know. This inferior peasant bread was actually more nutritious than the white bread that nobles prize so highly. Modern nutritional analysis of recreated medieval maslin bread shows that it was packed with fibre, protein, minerals and vitamins that were completely absent from refined white bread. The peasants, unknowingly, were eating a much healthier diet than their social superiors. There's this incredible irony in medieval bread culture that perfectly captures the contradictions of their entire society. The people with the most power and wealth were literally malnourishing themselves with refined white bread, while the peasants they looked down upon were eating bread that would make a modern nutritionist weep with joy. But the story of medieval bread gets even more complex when we start talking about the politics of grain. Every single grain of wheat in medieval England was tracked, taxed and controlled by an incredibly complex system of laws and regulations. The assize of bread, established by King John in 1202, created a direct mathematical relationship between the price of grain and the size and price of bread loaves. Dr. James Davis, who analysed thousands of medieval court records for his book Medieval Market Morality, found that bread prices were checked and adjusted weekly in most English towns. If grain prices went up, bread loaves got smaller. If grain prices dropped, loaves got bigger. It was like an ancient version of economic policy, but focused entirely on keeping people fed. Here's something that really gets to me about medieval bread culture. Despite all the regulations, despite all the social hierarchies, despite all the theological implications, bread was also the centre of community life in ways that are almost impossible for us to understand today. In every medieval village there was usually only one oven large enough to bake bread, either belonging to the lord of the manor or shared by the community. This meant that bread making was inherently communal. Women would prepare their dough at home, mark it with their family's unique symbol, and then bring it to the communal oven to be baked alongside their neighbours' loaves. Can you picture that? Imagine if every family in your neighbourhood had to bring their bread to one shared oven, taking turns throughout the day, chatting with neighbours while they waited, helping each other carry the heavy loaves home. Bread baking wasn't just cooking, it was social networking, community building and neighbourhood watch all rolled into one. But perhaps the most touching aspect of medieval bread culture was something called bread blessing. Before any loaf was cut, even the humblest maslin bread, the head of household would make the sign of the cross over it and say a prayer. This wasn't just religious ceremony, it was a recognition that bread represented the difference between life and death. Medieval families had specific rituals around bread that would seem almost sacred to us today. The first slice was always offered to guests. The last crust was saved for the poorest member of the household. Bread was never thrown away. Even mouldy bread was dried and ground into breadcrumbs for cooking. There are household management guides from the 14th century that include dozens of recipes for using every scrap of leftover bread. Elizabeth David, the renowned food historian, found evidence that medieval households had special containers called bread arks that were designed to keep bread fresh for as long as possible. These weren't just simple boxes, they were carefully crafted pieces of furniture with specific ventilation systems, moisture controls and even locks to prevent theft. Think about that for a moment. Bread was so valuable that families had locked furniture specifically designed to protect it. When was the last time you worried about someone stealing your bread? But here's where the story takes a turn that's both fascinating and terrifying. Because bread was so central to medieval life, when something went wrong with the bread supply, entire societies could collapse almost overnight. And I'm not just talking about famines from bad harvests. I'm talking about something much more sinister that could turn bread from life-sustaining nourishment into a deadly poison. There was a particular type of grain contamination that medieval people called St. Anthony's fire, and when it struck it could transform an entire community's daily bread into something that would literally drive people insane. The effects were so horrifying, so inexplicable to medieval minds, that they believed their bread had been cursed by demons. Now, before we dive into that terrifying tale of cursed bread, let me take you on a journey that will completely revolutionize how you think about flavor, wealth, and global economics. Because while medieval peasants were surviving on their simple porridge and dark bread, there was an entire shadow economy built around substances so valuable that men would literally sail off the edge of the known world to find them. I'm talking about spices, but not the little jars of oregano and paprika sitting in your spice rack. I'm talking about medieval spices that were worth more per ounce than gold, that sparked wars, toppled empires, and yes, ultimately led to the discovery of America. Here's a fact that's going to completely blow your mind. In medieval London, A pound of black pepper cost the equivalent of what an average worker made in an entire month. Think about that for a second. Imagine if a small container of black pepper at your grocery store cost you your entire monthly salary. That's the economic reality medieval people lived with. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. And this is something that completely changed my understanding of medieval cuisine. The reason spices were so insanely expensive wasn't just because they came from far away. It was because by the time a single peppercorn made it from a spice garden in India to a medieval European kitchen, it had passed through the hands of dozens of middlemen, survived pirates, sandstorms, shipwrecks, and political upheavals across 3 continents. Marco Polo, in his famous travels documented in Il Milione, described the spice trade routes in detail that would make modern logistics experts weep. A bag of black pepper grown in Kerala, India, would first be sold to Arab traders, who would transport it by camel caravan across the Arabian Peninsula to ports like Alexandria. From there, Venetian merchants would buy it and ship it across the Mediterranean to European markets, where local spice dealers would finally sell it to wealthy households. Each person in this chain needed to make a profit, and each leg of the journey carried enormous risks. Dr. Paul Friedman, who wrote the definitive work Out of the East, Spices and the Medieval Imagination, calculated that by the time spices reached European consumers, they were marked up by as much as 3,000% from their original price. But here's where this story gets really fascinating. Medieval people didn't use spices the way we do today. We think of spices as flavor enhancers, things we add to make food taste better. Medieval people thought of spices as medicine. Literally medicine. They believed that different spices could cure diseases, balance bodily humours, and even extend life. According to medieval medical theory, documented extensively in texts like the Trotula, a collection of medieval medical writings, each spice had specific healing properties. Black pepper was believed to cure stomach ailments and improve digestion. Cinnamon was thought to strengthen the heart and purify the blood. Ginger was prescribed for everything from nausea to impotence. Here's something that'll make you laugh. Medieval physicians actually prescribed specific spice combinations based on your astrological sign. If you were born under Mars, you needed hot spices like pepper and mustard. If you were born under Venus, you needed sweet spices like cinnamon and cloves. There are surviving medical manuscripts that read like a combination cookbook and horoscope. But the real reason spices were so valued in medieval society goes much deeper than medicine or flavour. Spices were the ultimate status symbol. When you served heavily spiced food to guests, you weren't just showing off your wealth. You were demonstrating your connections to global trade networks, your sophistication, your worldliness. The Ménagier de Paris, a 14th century household management guide written by a wealthy Parisian merchant for his young wife, includes detailed instructions on how to use spices to impress guests. It literally says that a wife's skill in seasoning food reflects directly on her husband's social standing and business acumen. Now here's something that most people don't realise about medieval spice use. The wealthy didn't just use a little bit of spice to enhance their food. They used spices in quantities that would shock modern palates. We're talking about meat dishes that were literally encrusted with spices, stews that were more spice than actual food, wines that were so heavily spiced they were barely recognisable as wine. Food historian Constance Hyatt analysed dozens of surviving medieval cookbooks and found recipes calling for amounts of spices that seem almost insane by modern standards. One recipe for spiced wine from a 15th century English noble household calls for 2 pounds of ginger, 1 pound of cinnamon, and half a pound of cloves to flavour a single barrel of wine. That's more spice than most modern restaurants use in a month. But here's the part that really gets to me. the part that shows how desperately medieval people craved these flavours. Even the middle class, people who could barely afford basic spices, would save up money for months just to buy enough spices for special occasions. There are household account books from medieval merchants showing families spending the equivalent of several weeks' income on spices for a single wedding feast or Christmas dinner. Can you imagine wanting something so badly that you'd save for months just to experience those flavours for one special meal? When was the last time you craved a particular taste so intensely that you'd sacrifice other necessities to get it? But the medieval spice trade wasn't just about luxury and status. It was also about deception, fraud, and sometimes outright poisoning. Because spices were so valuable and came from so far away, there was an entire industry built around faking them. Medieval spice dealers developed incredibly sophisticated methods of adulterating expensive spices with cheaper substitutes. Dr. Friedman's research uncovered guild records showing that fake pepper, made from ground juniper berries, was so common that legitimate pepper dealers had to mark their goods with special seals to prove authenticity. Here's something that would terrify modern food safety inspectors. Medieval cinnamon often contained ground tree bark, sawdust, and sometimes even toxic substances like red lead to achieve the right colour. Saffron, the most expensive spice of all, was routinely mixed with dried marigold petals, turmeric, or even coloured chalk. The penalties for spice fraud were severe. Guild records from medieval Venice show spice dealers being fined enormous sums, having their goods confiscated, and sometimes even being banned from trade. But the profits were so huge that many dealers considered these risks just part of doing business. Now, here's where this story takes a turn that literally changed the course of world history. The astronomical cost and constant supply problems with spices led to one of the most consequential decisions in human history: the search for a direct sea route to Asia. When Christopher Columbus convinced Queen Isabella to fund his voyage in 1492, he wasn't looking for a new continent. He was looking for a way to bypass all those expensive middlemen and get spices directly from their source. His famous letter to the Spanish crown, promising gold, spices and souls, put spices right at the centre of his pitch for funding. Think about that for a moment. The discovery of America, the entire course of world history, the colonization of the New World, all of it started because medieval Europeans were so obsessed with spices that they were willing to sail off the edge of the known world to find them. But here's the ultimate irony of the medieval spice trade, something that perfectly captures the absurdity of medieval food culture. While the wealthy were bankrupting themselves to buy exotic spices from Asia, many of the herbs and plants growing wild in European forests were actually more nutritious and flavourful than the spices they were importing at enormous cost. Medieval Europeans walked past wild garlic, nettle, elderflower, and dozens of other flavourful plants that could have transformed their cuisine, all while spending fortunes on pepper and cinnamon. They had access to incredible local ingredients that they completely ignored, because those ingredients weren't rare, expensive, or exotic enough to convey status. It's like if modern people decided that the only vegetables worth eating were ones that cost $100 per pound and had to be flown in from other planets, while completely ignoring the perfectly good vegetables growing in their own backyards. But speaking of what medieval people were actually drinking with all these spiced foods, that's where we encounter something that might surprise you even more than the spice trade. Because when it comes to medieval beverages, we're entering a world where alcohol wasn't just socially acceptable at breakfast. It was literally safer than the alternative. Imagine waking up on a typical Tuesday morning in medieval England, and the first thing you reach for isn't coffee, isn't orange juice, isn't even water. It's a mug of ale. Then you give some to your 6-year-old daughter. Then you pack some in a container to drink with lunch. Then you have more with dinner. By modern standards, you and your entire family would be functioning alcoholics before noon. But in medieval times, you'd just be staying alive. This is going to sound absolutely insane to modern ears, but medieval people, from tiny children to elderly grandparents, consumed an average of 1 to 2 gallons of ale per person per day. Let me repeat that. 1 to 2 gallons. Every single day. Food historian Richard Unger, in his comprehensive study, Beer in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, analysed hundreds of medieval household account books and monastery records to reach this staggering conclusion. Now, before you start picturing medieval villages full of stumbling drunks, let me explain something that completely changes this picture. The ale that medieval people drank daily wasn't like modern beer. It was called small ale, or table ale, and it had an alcohol content of only about 1–3%. To put that in perspective, modern beer is usually 4–6% alcohol, and wine is 12–15%. Medieval daily ale was basically lightly alcoholic flavoured water, but here's the part that really drove this point home for me. Medieval children had their own special category of ale called children's ale that was even weaker, sometimes less than 1% alcohol. There are surviving household management guides, like the famous Rules for Robert Grosser test, that include specific instructions for brewing different strengths of ale for different family members. So why were medieval people essentially living on beer? The answer is both simpler and more terrifying than you might expect. Water could kill you. In medieval cities especially, water sources were contaminated with everything you can imagine, and some things you really don't want to imagine. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food, dead animals. All of this regularly ended up in the same wells and rivers that people drew their drinking water from. Dr. Dolly Jørgensen, who studies medieval urban environments at the University of Stavanger, found evidence that medieval London's water was so contaminated that city officials actually recommended ale over water for daily consumption. There are official city records from the 14th century advising citizens to drink not the water of the Thames unless it be boiled, but rather the ale of good brewers. Here's something that completely blew my mind when I first learned about it. The brewing process, even the simple version used for daily ale, naturally killed harmful bacteria through a combination of boiling and fermentation. Medieval people didn't understand the science behind this. They didn't know about bacteria or sanitation in the modern sense, but they had empirically figured out that people who drank ale stayed healthier than people who drank water. This knowledge was so well established that it shows up in medieval medical texts. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a famous medieval health guide from the medical school at Salerno, explicitly states that ale is safer and more healthful than water for daily consumption. But here's where this story gets really interesting. Ale wasn't just a beverage in medieval society, it was a form of currency, a social lubricant, and the foundation of women's economic power. Because brewing was primarily women's work, and good brewers could make serious money, medieval brewing was dominated by women called alewives, and these weren't just housewives making a little beer for the family. These were professional businesswomen running complex operations. Judith Bennett, who wrote the definitive study Ale, Beer and Brewsters in England, found evidence that successful alewives could earn more money than skilled male craftsmen. The best alewives had regular customers who would pre-order specific types of ale, had apprentices learning the trade and even owned their own alehouses. There are court records from medieval England showing alewives appearing before judges not as defendants, but as plaintiffs suing customers who hadn't paid their bills. Here's something that really captures how central ale was to medieval life. In many English villages, when an alewife had finished brewing a new batch, she would hang a special bush or pole outside her house to announce that fresh ale was available. This tradition was so important that it was regulated by law. There were specific fines for hanging the ale bush when you didn't actually have ale for sale. Can you imagine if every time someone in your neighbourhood finished cooking dinner, they had to hang a sign outside to let everyone know food was available? That's essentially how integrated ale production was into daily medieval life, but the types of ale available would absolutely amaze you. Medieval brewers didn't just make one standard beer, they created dozens of different varieties for different purposes and different social classes. There was God's ale for religious celebrations, bride ale for weddings, which is actually where we get the word bridal, Scot ale for tax payments, and help ale for community fundraising. Peter Matthias, in his study The Brewing Industry in England, found records of medieval ales flavoured with everything from herbs and spices to fruits and flowers. Rosemary ale for memory, chamomile ale for sleep, elderflower ale for spring celebrations, and even ale flavoured with exotic spices for the wealthy. Here's something that shows just how sophisticated medieval brewing could be. There are surviving recipes from 15th century English monasteries for ales that required aging for 6 months or more, with complex combinations of herbs that were added at different stages of the brewing process. These weren't simple farmers making basic beer. These were master craftsmen creating beverages that would impress modern craft brewers. But perhaps the most touching aspect of medieval ale culture was its role in community building. Ale was the centre of virtually every social gathering. When someone died, the community would brew funeral ale and gather to share memories. When someone got married, everyone contributed ingredients for bride ale. When crops were harvested, villages would pool resources for harvest ale. There's this beautiful tradition documented in medieval English villages called church ales, where the entire community would brew ale together to raise money for church repairs or to help poor families. Everyone would contribute what they could: grain, fuel for the fire, labour for the brewing, and then they'd sell the ale to raise funds for community needs. Think about that for a moment. These people turned brewing beer into a form of crowdfunding and community service. They created social bonds and solved local problems, all centred around the production and sharing of ale. When was the last time your community came together around food or drink to solve a shared problem? But here's where medieval drinking culture gets really wild, and this is something that shows just how different their world was from ours. Medieval people had completely different ideas about when and how it was appropriate to drink alcohol. Not only was it normal to drink ale with breakfast, it was considered strange not to. There are surviving etiquette guides from medieval courts that include specific instructions on proper drinking behaviour. The Baby's Book, a 15th century guide to courtly manners, includes detailed rules about how to drink ale politely, how much to drink at different times of day, and even how to hold your cup properly. But here's something that really drives home how central alcohol was to medieval life. When medieval people wanted to insult someone or question their character, they didn't call them a drunk, they called them a water drinker. Drinking only water was seen as a sign of poverty, poor judgment, or religious extremism. Medieval people had an entire vocabulary around different types of drinking that we've completely lost. They distinguished between drinking for health, the daily consumption of small ale, drinking for fellowship, social drinking at gatherings, and drinking for drunkenness, which was generally frowned upon except during specific celebrations. This sophisticated understanding of alcohol and its proper use extended to children's education. Medieval children were taught not just how to brew ale, but when to drink it, how much to drink, and how to recognise when ale had gone bad. It was considered essential life knowledge, like teaching a child to read or write. But I want you to think about something as we wrap up this part of our journey. Medieval people created an entire culture around a beverage that was simultaneously medicine, currency, social bond and daily sustenance. They developed rituals, traditions, and community structures all centered around the production and sharing of ale. In our modern world, we've gained incredible safety and variety in our drinking options. But have we lost something essential about how beverages can bring communities together? When was the last time you shared a drink with neighbours in a way that strengthened your community bonds? But as sophisticated as medieval ale culture was, it was still just one part of a much larger food ecosystem that most people today can barely imagine. Because when we start exploring the medieval equivalent of fast food, the street vendors, taverns, and market stalls that fed urban workers, we discover a world of quick meals and take-out food that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien to modern sensibilities. Walking through the bustling streets of medieval London around noon, you'd encounter something that would feel surprisingly familiar, yet utterly bizarre at the same time. The air would be thick with the smell of roasting meat, fresh bread, and bubbling stews. Street vendors would be calling out their wares in voices that could be heard 3 blocks away. Workers would be grabbing quick meals between jobs, eating while they walked. Sound familiar? You're looking at the medieval equivalent of fast food, but with a twist that would make modern health inspectors faint on the spot. Medieval cities had an entire ecosystem of quick food that was remarkably sophisticated. But here's the kicker. Most of this food was prepared and sold without any of the safety regulations, refrigeration, or sanitation standards we take for granted today. We're talking about meat pies that sat out in the sun for hours, stews that were reheated day after day, and milk that was sold by vendors who had no way to keep it cold. Let me paint you a picture of medieval London's street food scene that comes from the actual court records of the city. Dr. Barbara Hannawalt, who spent decades studying medieval London court documents, found evidence of an incredibly diverse fast food culture. There were piermen selling meat pies from portable ovens, alewives with mobile beer carts, regrators reselling food in smaller portions, and even saucers who specialised in selling different types of gravies and condiments. Here's something that completely blew my mind. Medieval London had designated food streets, where different types of vendors clustered together. Bread Street for bakers, Milk Street for dairy vendors, Poultry for chicken sellers, and Fish Street for... well, you get the idea. It was like an ancient version of a food court, except spread across entire city blocks. But the star of medieval fast food was something called pies, and these weren't the sweet dessert pies you're thinking of. Medieval pies were essentially edible containers made of thick, durable pastry that could hold meat, vegetables, or stew. Food historian C.M. Woolgar, in his study The Culture of Food in England, describes these pies as medieval Tupperware. They were designed to be portable, practical, and able to keep food fresh without refrigeration. Here's what's absolutely fascinating about medieval pies. The crust wasn't meant to be eaten. It was called a coffin, or coffin, and it was made so thick and hard that it could literally stand up on its own when filled with food. Workers would buy these pies, eat the filling, and throw away the crust. Can you imagine if modern fast food came in completely edible packaging that most people just threw away? The variety of medieval street food would absolutely amaze you. There were pasties filled with meat and vegetables, essentially the ancestor of the modern Cornish pasty. There were frumenti vendors selling a porridge-like dish made from wheat, milk, and spices. There were wafer sellers with thin, crispy bread that was the medieval equivalent of crackers or chips. But here's where medieval fast food gets really wild. There were vendors who specialised in selling just sauces and seasonings. These sauces would set up shop near other food vendors and sell different types of gravies, mustards, and spice mixtures that customers could add to their meals. It was like having a medieval condiment bar right on the street, John Stowe, writing in his 1598 Survey of London, described the medieval fast food scene with details that sound almost modern. Every street corner had its vendor, every market its specialty, and every working man his preferred seller of quick victuals. He noted that many workers had regular arrangements with specific vendors, essentially the medieval equivalent of having a favourite food truck. But the real genius of medieval fast food was how it solved the same problems that modern fast food addresses. Feeding people who worked long hours, had limited cooking facilities, and needed portable, affordable meals. Medieval apprentices living in tiny rooms above shops, day labourers working construction projects, merchants travelling between cities. They all relied on street food for their daily sustenance. Here's something that really brings this home. Archaeological excavations in medieval London have uncovered thousands of discarded pie crusts, oyster shells, and food containers near workshops and construction sites. Medieval workers were literally leaving behind the same kind of take-out trash that modern construction workers leave behind, just made from different materials. The economics of medieval fast food were fascinating too. Food historian Derek Keene's analysis of medieval London market records shows that street food was often cheaper per calorie than buying ingredients and cooking at home. A meat pie from a vendor cost about the same as buying the raw meat alone from a butcher, but it came already cooked, seasoned, and in an edible container. But here's where things get really interesting, and potentially dangerous. Medieval fast food vendors developed incredibly creative ways to make food appear fresh and appealing, even when it wasn't. There were vendors who specialised in refreshing day-old bread by steaming it with herbs. There were pie sellers who would add fresh gravy to pies that had been sitting out for hours to make them seem newly made. The medieval authorities were constantly battling food fraud among street vendors. The London Liber Albus, a collection of city laws from the 15th century, includes detailed regulations about food quality, pricing, and vendor behaviour. There were official ale conners who tested the quality of ale sold by street vendors, bread weighers who checked that loaves were the proper size, and even pie wardens who inspected the contents of meat pies. Here's a detail that shows just how serious food quality issues were. Medieval London had official punishments specifically designed for dishonest food vendors. The pillory was a wooden contraption where fraudulent bakers would be locked in place with the offending loaf hung around their neck. The cucking stool was used to publicly shame alewives who watered down their beer. There are court records showing these punishments being used regularly. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of medieval fast food was how vendors dealt with the complete lack of refrigeration. They developed preservation and reheating techniques that were remarkably sophisticated. Pie vendors would bury their pies in hot coals to keep them warm all day. Stew sellers had special pots with thick walls that could keep food hot for hours. Dairy vendors mixed their milk with ale or wine to prevent spoilage. Food historian Ken Albala found evidence that medieval vendors had seasonal menus that changed based on what ingredients were available and what preservation methods worked best in different weather. Summer vendors focused on fresh fruits, vegetables, and dairy. Winter vendors specialised in preserved meats, dried fruits, and hearty stews that could withstand cold temperatures. Here's something that really gets to me about medieval fast food culture. Despite all the health risks, despite the lack of regulations, despite the constant threat of food poisoning, these vendors created genuine communities around their food. Regular customers knew their vendors by name, vendors knew their customers' preferences, and there was a level of personal relationship that most modern fast food completely lacks. The medieval equivalent of a food truck wasn't just a business transaction, it was a social interaction. Vendors were neighbourhood figures who knew the local gossip, helped settle disputes, and sometimes even extended credit to regular customers during hard times. There are court records showing food vendors testifying as character witnesses for their customers, and customers defending vendors against accusations of fraud. But here's what's most remarkable about medieval fast food. It worked. Despite all the obvious health and safety issues, medieval cities successfully fed thousands of working people every day through this network of street vendors and quick food sellers. It was a complex, adaptive system that responded to real human needs in ways that were often ingenious and surprisingly effective. Think about that the next time you grab a quick lunch from a food truck or order takeout from your phone. The fundamental human need for quick, affordable, portable food has been driving innovation for over 1,000 years. We've gained incredible safety and variety, but we've also lost something about the personal relationships and community connections that medieval fast food fostered. Now, while medieval workers were grabbing quick pies and ale from street vendors, there was an entirely different universe of food happening behind the walls of castles and manor houses. Because when medieval nobles decided to throw a feast, they didn't just serve dinner. They created theatrical spectacles of abundance and excess that would make modern celebrity parties look like quiet family dinners. Picture yourself standing at the gates of a medieval castle on the night of a great feast, and what you're about to witness will completely shatter every assumption you have about medieval dining. We're not talking about a fancy dinner party here. We're talking about theatrical spectacles so outrageous, so excessive, that they would make modern billionaire parties look like church potlucks. Medieval feasts weren't just meals. They were political theatre, psychological warfare, and artistic performances all served on golden plates. Let me tell you about one specific feast that was so legendary, it was documented by multiple chroniclers and still makes historians gasp today. In 1468, George Neville, the Archbishop of York, threw a feast to celebrate his installation that lasted for days and served over 2,800 guests. The menu, preserved in the Warwick Roll, an actual surviving document, included 104 oxen, 6 wild bulls, 1,000 sheep, 304 calves, 400 swans, 2,000 geese, 1,000 capons, 2,000 pigs, 500 stags, and 4,000 rabbits. And that was just the meat course. But here's what makes these numbers even more mind-blowing. Food historian C.M. Woolgar calculated that this single feast consumed more meat than the average medieval peasant would see in their entire lifetime. We're talking about a meal that could have fed entire villages for months, served to people who were already among the best fed in society. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's just rich people being excessive. But medieval feasts served a purpose that goes far beyond showing off wealth. These events were carefully orchestrated displays of power that communicated complex political messages to everyone in attendance. Dr. Martin Allen, who studies medieval feasting culture at the University of Cardiff, describes these events as edible diplomacy. Every dish served, every seating arrangement, every ceremonial gesture was loaded with political meaning. Here's something that completely changed how I understood medieval politics. The order in which dishes were served at a feast could literally determine the success or failure of military alliances. If you were seated below someone of supposedly lower rank, or if you were served a particular dish before or after someone else, it was a public statement about your political status that could affect your family's fortunes for generations. The surviving household accounts from Edward III's court, analysed by historian Anne Sutton, show that medieval feast planners employed people whose only job was to manage the symbolic meaning of food service. These weren't caterers. They were political strategists who understood that a misplaced salt cellar or an incorrectly timed wine service could spark diplomatic incidents. But the sheer spectacle of medieval feast entertainment would blow your mind. These weren't quiet dinner parties where people sat around making polite conversation. Medieval feasts featured live entertainment that was completely integrated with the meal service. We're talking about elaborate pageants performed between courses, musicians playing from hidden galleries, and food presentations that were essentially theatrical performances. One of the most famous examples comes from the Feast of the Pheasant held by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, in 1454. Contemporary chronicler Olivier de la Marche documented every detail of this event, and it reads like something from a fantasy novel. Between the meat course and the dessert course, they wheeled in a massive pastry castle complete with working miniature cannons that fired rosewater at the guests, while a live elephant, yes, a real elephant, carried a tower containing a musician playing a hunting horn. Can you imagine being at a dinner party where they bring out military-grade artillery made of pastry and fire perfume at you, while an elephant walks around the dining room? That was just Tuesday night for medieval nobility. But here's where medieval feasts get really wild. The food itself was often designed to be as visually shocking as possible, sometimes at the expense of actually being edible. Medieval cookbook manuscripts like the famous Vivendier from 14th century France include recipes for dishes that were more art installation than meal. There were gilt chickens covered in real gold leaf, peacocks that were skinned, roasted, and then redressed in their original feathers to appear alive, and elaborate jellies shaped like castles complete with tiny edible knights fighting battles. Food historian Melita Weiss-Adamson found evidence of medieval chefs creating dishes that moved, sang, or even exploded when cut open. Here's a detail that really drives home how theatrical these events were. Medieval feasts employed professional carvers, whose job wasn't just to cut meat, but to perform elaborate ceremonial cutting rituals that could last for 20 minutes per dish. These carvers trained for years to learn the proper movements, the correct angles, the traditional phrases that had to be spoken while carving different types of meat. The Book of Keringay, a 15th century English manual for carvers, includes instructions so detailed they read like choreography for a ballet. There were specific ways to carve a swan, called lifting a swan, different techniques for deer, breaking a deer, and elaborate procedures for serving fish, splaying a bream, that involved dozens of precise movements. But perhaps the most mind-blowing aspect of medieval feasts was something called subtleties. Elaborate food sculptures that were served between courses. These weren't just decorative centerpieces. They were edible works of art that often told complete stories or conveyed complex political messages. Food historian Peter Breers documented some truly incredible examples from English royal feasts. There were subtleties depicting entire battle scenes with hundreds of edible soldiers, elaborate castles complete with working drawbridges made from sugar and marzipan, and even religious scenes with edible figures of saints performing miracles. One subtlety from a feast honouring Henry VI in 1432 was described by contemporary chroniclers as a complete nativity scene made entirely from edible materials, including sugar angels suspended on nearly invisible wires that appeared to be flying around the manger. When the guests had finished admiring it, they literally ate baby Jesus. Here's something that really captures the excess of these events. Medieval nobles would sometimes serve courses that included dozens of different dishes simultaneously. The form of curie, a cookbook compiled by the master cooks of Richard Termed, includes menus for royal feasts that list 30-40 different dishes for a single course, and there were usually 3 or 4 courses per feast. Think about that for a moment. While peasants were carefully rationing their single pot of pottage to last all day, nobles were sitting down to meals that included more variety in one course than most people would see in a year. Dr. Barbara Harvey's analysis of medieval Westminster Abbey's account books shows that a single feast could consume more imported spices than the Abbey used in normal meals for an entire month. But here's what's most fascinating about medieval feast culture. Despite all the excess, despite the obvious waste, these events served genuine social and political functions that were essential to medieval society. Feasts were where alliances were formed, Marriages were negotiated, disputes were settled, and news was shared across vast distances. The Great Hall of a medieval castle during a feast was essentially the internet, television, newspaper, and political convention all rolled into one. People would travel for days to attend important feasts, not just for the food, but for the information, connections, and business opportunities these events provided. Chronicle accounts from medieval feasts show nobles using meal conversations to negotiate everything from trade agreements to military alliances. The seating arrangements alone were a complex form of communication that told everyone in attendance exactly where they stood in the political hierarchy. But there's a darker side to this feast culture that's equally fascinating. The psychological pressure these events created for their hosts. Medieval nobles bankrupted themselves, throwing feasts they couldn't afford, because failing to maintain the expected level of hospitality could destroy their political credibility overnight. There are surviving household account books from medieval English nobles showing families selling land, borrowing money, and going into debt to finance feasts that would maintain their social standing. The pressure to outdo previous feasts led to an escalating arms race of culinary excess that sometimes literally drove noble families into poverty. Here's a perfect example. Thomas Beckington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, threw a feast in 1443 that was so expensive it consumed 3 years' worth of his episcopal income. Contemporary records show he had to borrow money from Italian bankers and sell church property to pay for a single evening's entertainment. Think about the psychological pressure of living in a world where your political survival depended on throwing dinner parties that could bankrupt you, where every meal you served was being judged not just for its quality, but for its political implications and social messaging. But even as nobles were bankrupting themselves with increasingly elaborate feasts, there was another side of medieval food culture developing that was equally extreme but in the opposite direction. Because while the wealthy were gorging themselves on golden peacocks and edible castles, medieval society was also creating some of the most severe restrictions on eating that the world has ever seen. What if I told you that while medieval nobles were literally eating gold-covered peacocks, there were people in the same society who considered eating an apple to be a serious sin? Welcome to the bizarre world of medieval superfoods, ingredients that were believed to possess almost magical powers to heal, strengthen, and even grant eternal life. But here's the twist. Most of these wonder foods were things you'd probably throw in your compost bin today. Medieval people didn't just eat for sustenance or pleasure. They ate according to a complex medical theory that would make modern nutritionists either laugh or cry. Every single bite of food was categorized according to something called the doctrine of humours, a system so intricate and specific that medieval physicians could prescribe exact meals to cure everything from depression to infertility. Dr. Luke DeMate, who studies medieval medicine at the University of Virginia, spent years analysing medieval medical manuscripts and discovered something remarkable. Medieval people had identified and were regularly consuming foods that modern science has confirmed to be nutritional powerhouses. The problem was, they were eating them for completely wrong reasons based on theories that were totally bonkers. Let me give you an example that perfectly captures the weird genius of medieval nutrition. Medieval physicians prescribed eating walnuts for brain health, which, as it turns out, is actually scientifically sound advice. Walnuts are packed with omega-3 fatty acids that are essential for cognitive function, but medieval doctors recommended walnuts for brain health because they thought walnuts looked like tiny brains, and according to the doctrine of signatures, foods that resembled body parts would cure ailments in those parts. The doctrine of signatures was this fascinating belief system that held that God had marked every plant and food with a visual clue about its medicinal properties. Kidney beans were good for kidney problems because they looked like kidneys. Red beets were good for blood disorders because they were red like blood. Carrots were good for eyesight because when you sliced them, they looked like eyes with pupils. Here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. This completely unscientific system accidentally led medieval people to some remarkably healthy food choices. Food historian Melita Weiss-Adamson found evidence that medieval European diets included far more variety of vegetables, herbs, and whole grains than most modern diets, all because people were trying to cure various ailments with foods that happened to be incredibly nutritious. Medieval superfoods included things that would make modern health food enthusiasts jealous. They regularly consumed nettle, which is packed with iron, vitamins, and minerals. They ate dandelion greens, which are incredibly high in antioxidants. They used elderflower, which has natural antiviral properties. They consumed massive amounts of garlic, which we now know has genuine antimicrobial and cardiovascular benefits. But here's where medieval nutrition gets really wild. They had developed incredibly sophisticated methods of food preparation and preservation that accidentally maximize the nutritional value of their ingredients. The process of making sauerkraut, which medieval people did primarily to preserve cabbage through winter, creates beneficial probiotics that are essential for gut health. Medieval people didn't know about bacteria or digestive health. They just knew that fermented cabbage kept them feeling better during the cold months. Food historian Sally Granger, who specializes in historical food preparation methods, discovered that medieval fermentation techniques actually increased the bioavailability of nutrients in ways that medieval people couldn't have understood. They were essentially creating supercharged nutritional supplements using nothing but traditional preservation methods. Here's something that completely changed my perspective on medieval health. Despite having no understanding of vitamins, minerals, or modern nutritional science, medieval people managed to avoid scurvy, rickets, and most of the nutritional deficiency diseases that plagued later historical periods. How? They were accidentally eating incredibly well-balanced diets based on seasonal availability and traditional food combinations. Medieval people ate organ meats, which are incredibly nutrient-dense. They consumed bone broths, which provide essential minerals and collagen. They ate wild greens and herbs that are packed with vitamins that cultivated vegetables often lack. They combined grains and legumes in ways that created complete proteins. All of this happened because of tradition, taste, and availability, not because they understood the science behind it. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval superfoods was their approach to something they called food as medicine. Medieval physicians didn't just prescribe herbs and potions, they prescribed entire meal plans designed to cure specific ailments. And some of these prescriptions were remarkably sophisticated. The Taquinum Sanitatis, a medieval health manual based on Arabic medical knowledge, includes detailed dietary prescriptions that modern nutritionists would recognize as sound advice. For depression, medieval doctors prescribed foods high in what we now know are mood-regulating nutrients. For digestive problems, they recommended foods that we now understand promote healthy gut bacteria. Here's a detail that really drives this home. Medieval physicians recognized that different people needed different diets based on their individual constitutions. The same illness might be treated with completely different food prescriptions, depending on the patient's age, gender, temperament, and even their astrological sign. It was personalized nutrition centuries before we had the science to understand why personalized nutrition matters. Medieval people had identified foods that they believed could extend life and prevent aging. These included things like pomegranates, which are indeed high in antioxidants, fish, excellent source of omega-3s, and various herbs that we now know have anti-inflammatory properties. They were basically doing anti-aging nutrition therapy based on empirical observation and traditional knowledge. But here's where medieval food culture gets really interesting. They had developed a concept of balanced eating that was remarkably sophisticated, even though it was based on completely incorrect scientific understanding. Medieval physicians taught that every meal should include foods from different categories: hot and cold, wet and dry, heavy and light, to maintain bodily harmony. This system accidentally led to incredibly varied, nutritionally complete meals. A typical medieval physician's ideal meal would include multiple vegetables, different types of grains, various herbs and spices, and carefully chosen proteins. It was essentially the Mediterranean diet, but prescribed for mystical reasons rather than scientific ones. Medieval people also understood something that modern nutrition science is just rediscovering: the importance of eating seasonally. They didn't have a choice, of course, but they developed elaborate theories about why spring foods were perfect for spring bodies and winter foods were necessary for winter health. Modern research suggests there's actually scientific validity to seasonal eating patterns. Here's something that would absolutely shock modern health food enthusiasts. Medieval people regularly consumed foods that we now consider exotic superfoods, but they treated them as basic medicine. Things like turmeric, ginger, and various fermented foods were standard parts of medieval European diets, imported through spice trade networks and integrated into daily meals for their supposed healing properties. Food historian Paul Friedman found evidence that medieval European kitchens regularly used ingredients that modern Western cuisine has largely forgotten, but that we're now rediscovering as nutritional powerhouses. Medieval Europeans ate insects, which are incredibly protein-dense, consumed seaweed packed with minerals, and used mushroom varieties that are now prized by modern mycologists for their health benefits. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval people had developed an understanding of food, combining that accidentally optimized nutrient absorption. They knew to eat iron-rich foods with foods high in what we now know is vitamin C. They combined different grains and legumes in ways that created complete amino acid profiles. They paired fats with certain vegetables in ways that increased the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. All of this happened through trial and error, tradition, and careful observation over generations, not because they understood the biochemistry behind it. Medieval people were essentially running a 1,000-year experiment in optimal human nutrition, and many of their conclusions were remarkably accurate, even though their explanations were completely wrong. Think about that for a moment. These people, with no scientific understanding of how nutrition works, managed to develop eating patterns that modern science is validating as incredibly healthy. They figured out through pure observation and tradition what we're now proving with biochemistry and clinical studies. But while medieval people were accidentally eating incredibly healthy diets through traditional wisdom and necessity, they were also developing cooking methods and kitchen technologies that would fundamentally transform how food could be prepared and preserved. And some of these innovations were so revolutionary that they literally changed the course of human civilization. But behind all these remarkable nutritional discoveries lurked a darker reality that medieval people lived with every single day: the constant threat that their next meal might literally kill them. And I'm not talking about the obvious dangers of spoiled meat or contaminated water. I'm talking about something far more sinister. The horrifying reality that the very grain that kept medieval society alive could, without warning, transform into a deadly poison that would drive entire communities into madness, hallucinations, and agonizing death. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire, holy fire, or sometimes just the burning sickness. But what they were actually experiencing was ergot poisoning, a fungal contamination of grain that could turn a loaf of bread into a hallucinogenic nightmare that would make modern horror movies look like children's cartoons. Dr. Mary Matossian, who conducted groundbreaking research on ergotism in medieval Europe, analysed hundreds of chronicles and medical records to map the occurrence of what medieval people thought were demonic possessions, divine punishments, or supernatural plagues. What she discovered was that these mysterious afflictions followed clear geographical and seasonal patterns that perfectly matched the conditions where ergot fungus thrives. Here's what makes this story absolutely terrifying. Ergot alkaloids are chemically related to LSD. When medieval people consumed ergot-contaminated bread, they weren't just getting food poisoning, they were basically dropping acid involuntarily. Entire villages would simultaneously experience hallucinations, convulsions, and psychotic episodes that could last for days or weeks. Let me paint you a picture of what an ergot outbreak looked like from the perspective of medieval chroniclers who had no understanding of what was really happening. In 1039, a chronicler in Limoges, France, documented an outbreak that he described as a plague of invisible fire that consumed the limbs of its victims while they still lived. People's hands and feet would turn black and fall off. Victims would report seeing demons, angels, or fantastical creatures. Some would dance uncontrollably for hours. Others would experience what they described as burning from within, as their blood vessels constricted and their extremities literally died while they were still alive. The medical historian Edward Shorter found evidence that ergot outbreaks often triggered mass hysteria events that medieval people interpreted as everything from divine intervention to witchcraft. The famous dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg, where hundreds of people danced uncontrollably for days until some of them literally danced themselves to death, shows clear signs of being an ergot poisoning event. But here's what's most horrifying about ergot poisoning. It preferentially affected the poor. Wealthy people who ate refined white bread made from carefully sifted flour were largely protected. Ergot primarily infected rye and other coarse grains that were used to make the dark bread that peasants depended on for survival. So the very people who had the least access to medical care were the ones most likely to be struck by this mysterious, terrifying affliction. Food historian William Chester Jordan documented how ergot outbreaks could destabilize entire regions. When large populations simultaneously experienced hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrenous limbs, it wasn't just a health crisis, it was a complete breakdown of social order. Agricultural work stopped, markets closed, religious authorities declared states of emergency. Military campaigns were abandoned as soldiers became too sick to fight. Here's a detail that really drives home how devastating these outbreaks could be. Medieval authorities developed specific legal procedures for dealing with ergot victims. There are surviving court records from 13th century France showing judges trying to determine whether people who committed crimes during ergot episodes should be held responsible for their actions. Imagine trying to run a legal system when you couldn't tell the difference between criminal behaviour and involuntary drug-induced psychosis. The Church developed elaborate rituals around ergot outbreaks that reveal how helpless medieval people felt in the face of this mysterious affliction. The Order of St. Anthony specialised in caring for ergot victims, and their hospitals became centres for treating what they called holy fire. They developed treatments that included amputation of gangrenous limbs, herbal remedies to counteract the psychotic symptoms, and elaborate prayer rituals to ward off what they believed were demonic attacks. But ergot wasn't the only way that medieval food could turn deadly. Food historian Frederick Simoons documented dozens of other ways that ordinary medieval meals could become lethal. Lead poisoning from pewter dishes and lead-glazed pottery was incredibly common, especially among the wealthy who could afford metal tableware. The symptoms, abdominal pain, neurological problems, and eventually death, were often mistaken for everything from witchcraft to divine punishment. Here's something that would absolutely horrify modern food safety inspectors. Medieval food preservation methods, while often ingenious, sometimes created perfect conditions for botulism, a deadly form of food poisoning that can cause paralysis and death. Improperly preserved meats, poorly sealed containers, and inadequate understanding of anaerobic bacteria meant that medieval people were constantly playing Russian roulette with preserved foods. The mortality rates from foodborne illness in medieval times were staggering. Dr. Barbara Hannawalt's analysis of medieval coroners' records from England shows that food poisoning was one of the leading causes of accidental death, especially during summer months when spoilage happened quickly. But medieval people had no understanding of bacteria, so they attributed these deaths to everything from bad air to planetary alignments. Medieval bread, despite being the staff of life, carried risks that would terrify modern consumers. Beyond ergot contamination, medieval grain was often infected with other fungi that could cause different types of poisoning. Fusarium contamination could cause symptoms similar to chronic alcoholism. Aspergillus contamination could lead to liver damage and cancer. Medieval people just knew that sometimes bread made people sick, and they had no way to predict when or why. But perhaps most tragically, medieval attempts to prevent food poisoning often made things worse. The practice of adding wine or vinegar to questionable meat might mask the taste of spoilage, but didn't eliminate the bacteria. The use of heavy spices to cover the smell of rotting food might make it more palatable but also more dangerous. Salt preservation, when done incorrectly, could create conditions that were perfect for deadly bacterial growth. Food historian Ken Albala found evidence that medieval people developed increasingly desperate strategies to avoid food poisoning as they learned through bitter experience that certain foods were dangerous. Some families would have designated tasters, often servants or children, who would eat questionable food first to see if it was safe. Imagine living in a world where you had to use your own children as canaries in coal mines for every meal. The economic impact of food poisoning in medieval society was enormous. When the breadwinner of a family died from contaminated food, it often meant poverty or starvation for the entire household. When livestock died from ergot-contaminated feed, it could wipe out a farm's income for an entire year. When ergot outbreaks struck during harvest time, entire regions could face famine. Medieval medical texts are filled with desperate attempts to understand and prevent food poisoning. The Regimen Sanitatis Salerniternum includes dozens of food safety rules that show medieval physicians were trying to figure out patterns. Don't eat meat that has been sitting in the sun. Avoid fish that smell strong. Don't drink milk that has curdled. They were essentially trying to develop food safety science through trial and error, with human lives as the experimental subjects. But here's what's most remarkable about medieval people's relationship with dangerous food. They kept eating, kept experimenting, kept developing new recipes and preservation methods, despite knowing that any meal could potentially kill them. They were essentially living with a level of food-related risk that would be completely unacceptable to modern society, but they had no choice except to adapt and survive. The psychological impact of living with constant food-related mortality must have been enormous. Imagine sitting down to every meal knowing that this simple act of nourishment could be your last. Imagine feeding your children, knowing that you might accidentally poison them with contaminated grain. Imagine the guilt of survival when your neighbours died from eating the same type of bread you've been eating safely for months. This constant danger created a food culture that was simultaneously more cautious and more fatalistic than anything we can understand today. Medieval people developed elaborate blessing rituals around meals not just for religious reasons, but because they genuinely believed each meal might be their last. They created complex social protocols around food sharing, because hospitality could literally be a matter of life and death. Yet somehow, despite all these dangers, medieval people managed to create the foundation for all the cooking techniques, preservation methods and food traditions that would eventually evolve into our modern culinary world. But the innovations they developed in their desperate quest for food safety would ultimately transform not just how people ate, but how entire civilizations could be sustained. Faced with these constant threats of death by dinner, medieval people became the most ingenious food innovators in human history. Out of sheer desperation to survive, they developed cooking techniques and kitchen technologies that were so revolutionary, they literally changed the course of civilization. And I'm not talking about minor improvements here. I'm talking about inventions that went from how do we not die from our food to how do we feed entire armies and build empires. Let me take you inside a medieval kitchen in the year 1300 and prepare to have your mind completely blown by what you'll find there. First, forget everything you think you know about medieval cooking being primitive or backwards. We're talking about kitchens that were more technologically sophisticated than most modern home kitchens, operated by people who understood heat management, timing, and food chemistry at a level that would impress professional chefs today. The centerpiece of every medieval kitchen was something that would seem like science fiction to modern cooks. A massive fireplace with multiple, independently controllable heat zones. Food historian Peter Breers, who spent decades studying medieval kitchen archaeology, discovered that major medieval kitchens had fireplaces that were essentially precision cooking instruments, disguised as simple stone structures. These weren't just big holes in the wall with a fire burning in them. Medieval kitchen fireplaces included adjustable trammel hooks that could raise or lower pots to precise heights above the flames, creating different temperature zones. They had rotating spits with gear systems that could turn massive roasts at perfectly controlled speeds. They had side ovens built into the chimney walls that could maintain different temperatures simultaneously for different types of baking. Here's something that completely changed how I understood medieval cooking. The most advanced medieval kitchens had what food historian Bridget Ann Hennish calls thermal management systems that were more sophisticated than most modern restaurant kitchens. They could simultaneously roast meat, boil stews, bake bread, smoke fish, and even distill alcohol, all using a single fire source but with precise temperature control for each cooking process. But the real innovation that medieval people developed was something that would revolutionize food safety and preservation: the chimney. Now you might think, a chimney? That's not that exciting. But let me explain why the medieval chimney was actually one of the most important technological breakthroughs in human history, and why it completely transformed not just cooking, but the entire structure of civilization. Before chimneys, which weren't widely adopted until the 12th century, cooking fires were basically controlled bonfires in the middle of rooms. Smoke escaped through holes in the roof, heat was impossible to control precisely, and the risk of fires destroying entire buildings was enormous. Dr. Matthew Johnson, who studies medieval domestic architecture at Northwestern University, found evidence that house fires from cooking accidents were the leading cause of property destruction in early medieval cities. The chimney changed everything. Suddenly you could have a controlled fire that was safe, efficient, and capable of precise heat management. But more importantly, chimneys made it possible to cook indoors year-round without filling your house with smoke. This meant that food preparation could become more complex, more time-intensive, and more sophisticated. Here's where it gets really interesting. The invention of the chimney led directly to the development of what food historians call thermal cooking. Cooking techniques that use precise temperature control to transform ingredients in ways that were previously impossible. Medieval cooks figured out how to caramelize sugars, reduce sauces to specific consistencies, and even create primitive forms of what we now call sous vide cooking using sealed pots and controlled steam. Medieval innovations in food preservation were equally mind-blowing. They developed smoking techniques that could preserve meat for months without refrigeration. They created salt curing methods that could keep fish edible for years. They invented fermentation processes that not only preserved food, but actually improved its nutritional value and flavour. But here's the innovation that really changed everything. Medieval people figured out how to use windmills and watermills for food processing on an industrial scale. Food historian John Langdon found evidence that medieval Europe had over 10,000 watermills by the year 1300, most of them dedicated to grinding grain, processing food, and manufacturing the tools needed for large-scale food production. These weren't simple grain mills. Medieval mills could press oil from olives and nuts, crush malt for brewing, process hemp and flax for food storage containers, and even power mechanical devices for mixing and kneading dough. They were essentially food processing factories powered entirely by renewable energy, centuries before anyone had conceived of industrial manufacturing. Here's something that would absolutely amaze modern engineers. Medieval millers developed gear systems and mechanical controls that were incredibly sophisticated. The mill at Barbegal in France, documented by archaeologist Kevin Green, was a complex of 16 water wheels that could process grain for an entire city. The engineering required to build and maintain these systems was more advanced than anything that would be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. Medieval people also revolutionized food storage and transportation. They developed barrel-making techniques that created containers so well sealed they could keep wine and beer fresh for years while being transported across continents. They invented portable ovens that could be assembled and disassembled by travelling armies. They created food preservation methods that allowed medieval armies to campaign for months without access to fresh supplies. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, provides incredible detail about the scale of medieval food processing infrastructure. England alone had over 6,000 documented mills, hundreds of specialised brewing facilities, and thousands of professional bakers, all operating with standardised tools and techniques that had been refined over generations. But perhaps the most remarkable medieval food innovation was something called controlled fermentation. Medieval brewers and food preservers figured out how to manage bacterial and yeast cultures to create specific flavours and preservation effects. They didn't understand the science behind what they were doing, but they had empirically developed techniques that modern food scientists recognise as incredibly sophisticated biotechnology. Medieval cheesemakers could control aging processes to create dozens of different varieties of cheese with specific flavours and preservation qualities. Medieval winemakers developed techniques for managing fermentation that created wines that could improve with age for decades. Medieval bread bakers maintained sourdough starters that had been passed down through families for generations, each one a unique bacterial culture that created distinctive flavours. Food historian Barbara Santich found evidence that medieval European food preservation techniques were so advanced that foods processed in medieval monasteries and professional kitchens often had longer shelf lives and better nutritional profiles than similar foods produced with early industrial methods centuries later. Here's what really gets to me about medieval food technology. These people were essentially running sophisticated biotechnology operations using nothing but empirical observation, traditional knowledge, and careful experimentation. They figured out how to manage complex chemical and biological processes that we now understand through advanced science, but they did it all through trial and error over generations. Medieval people also developed the first standardized recipe systems. Professional cooks created detailed instructions that could be followed by other cooks to reproduce specific dishes consistently. The form of curie, compiled by the master cooks of Richard II, includes precise measurements, timing instructions, and even quality control standards that would be familiar to modern professional chefs. But the innovation that might have had the biggest impact on world history was medieval improvements in navigation and food preservation that made long-distance sea voyages possible. The techniques medieval Europeans developed for preserving food for months at sea were essential for the age of exploration. Without medieval innovations in portable food preservation, Columbus couldn't have reached America, Vasco da Gama couldn't have reached India, and the entire course of world history would have been different. Think about that for a moment. The discovery of the New World, the establishment of global trade networks, the entire foundation of the modern global economy, all of it depended on medieval innovations in food technology that were developed by people trying to solve the basic problem of not dying from their dinner. Medieval food innovations also transformed urban development. Once people could cook safely indoors year-round, cities could become much larger and more densely populated. Once food could be preserved and transported efficiently, urban populations could grow beyond what local agriculture could support. Medieval food technology was essential for the development of the first true cities in European history. The ripple effects of medieval kitchen innovations are still with us today. Every time you use a chimney, every time you eat fermented food, every time you consume anything that's been milled, aged, preserved, or processed, you're benefiting from techniques that were developed by medieval people who were just trying to stay alive in a world where dinner could kill you. But as brilliant as these technological innovations were, they also created new forms of social control and economic inequality that medieval people couldn't have anticipated. Because once food production became industrialized and standardized, it also became a tool for political power and social manipulation. These remarkable technological advances created something that medieval people never anticipated. Food became the ultimate weapon of social control. What you ate, when you ate it, and even how you ate it became tools that the powerful used to keep everyone else in their place. We're talking about a system so sophisticated and so psychologically manipulative that it makes modern social media algorithms look like child's play. Let me tell you about something called sumptuary laws. Legal restrictions that literally controlled what people were allowed to eat based on their social class. These weren't suggestions or cultural traditions. These were actual laws, enforced by courts, with serious punishments for violations. And they reveal a level of food-based social control that would be absolutely unthinkable in modern democratic societies. In medieval England, the sumptuary laws of 1363, documented in the official parliamentary rolls, legally prohibited anyone below the rank of knight from eating certain foods. Peasants were forbidden from eating meat more than twice per week. Merchants couldn't serve more than 2 courses at a meal, regardless of how wealthy they were. Even successful business owners were legally prohibited from eating the same foods as hereditary nobles. But here's where it gets really wild. These laws didn't just control what you could eat, they controlled how you could eat it. Dr. Francis Baldwin, who studies medieval legal documents at Johns Hopkins, found evidence that sumptuary laws regulated everything from the types of plates you could use to the number of servants who could serve your meals. Your table setting was literally a legal matter that could land you in court. Medieval authorities understood something that modern psychologists are just rediscovering. Controlling people's access to pleasure is one of the most effective ways to maintain social hierarchies. When you can legally prevent someone from ever tasting certain foods, you're not just controlling their diet, you're controlling their aspirations, their social connections, and their sense of self-worth. Here's a specific example that perfectly captures how twisted this system was. In 14th century France, there were laws that prohibited merchants from serving swan at their dinner parties, even if they could afford it. Swan was reserved exclusively for nobility. But here's the kicker. The law didn't just say merchants couldn't eat swan. It said that if a merchant was caught serving swan, the punishment wasn't just a fine. They could be stripped of their merchant privileges and banned from trade entirely. Think about that for a moment. Your entire livelihood, your family's future, your children's inheritance, all of it could be destroyed because you served the wrong bird at a dinner party. Medieval authorities were essentially saying, stay in your lane or we'll destroy your life over a piece of poultry. Food historian Christopher Dyer found court records showing that these laws were actively enforced. There are documented cases of merchants being prosecuted for serving too many courses, peasants being fined for eating meat on unauthorized days, and even guild members being expelled for wearing the wrong clothes to meals. Medieval authorities had food police whose job was to monitor what people ate and how they ate it. But the psychological impact of these food restrictions was even more devastating than the legal penalties. Medieval people lived in a world where your daily meals were a constant reminder of your social inferiority. Every time a peasant looked at his bowl of porridge while knowing that nobles were eating roasted peacock, he was being reminded that he was considered fundamentally less worthy as a human being. The Catholic Church added another layer of food-based social control through elaborate fasting requirements that were designed to reinforce class hierarchies. The Liber Pontificalis documents how religious fasting rules were enforced differently for different social classes. Nobles could get dispensations to eat meat during Lent if they made appropriate donations to the church. Peasants had no such options. They had to follow the fasting rules strictly, regardless of their nutritional needs or work requirements. Here's something that really drives home how manipulative this system was. Medieval religious authorities taught that accepting your food restrictions was a sign of moral virtue. Poor people were told that their simple diet made them more spiritually pure than the wealthy. Meanwhile, wealthy people were told that their access to luxurious foods was a sign of God's favour. It was a perfect psychological trap that made victims of the system feel guilty for wanting better treatment. Medieval marriage laws even included food-based status restrictions. The legal documents preserved in medieval marriage contracts, analysed by historian Barbara Hannawalt, show that wives were legally required to serve meals that were appropriate to their husband's social rank. A merchant's wife could be legally punished for trying to serve noblemen's food, even in the privacy of her own home. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval food control was how it shaped children's understanding of their place in society. Medieval children learned social hierarchies through their daily meals. Children from different classes literally couldn't share meals together without breaking social and legal rules. Food historian Terence Scully found evidence that medieval schools had different meal programs for students from different social backgrounds, ensuring that class distinctions were reinforced every single day. The economic impact of food-based social control was enormous. By legally preventing lower classes from purchasing certain foods, medieval authorities artificially created luxury markets that kept prices high for status foods. This meant that even when merchants or successful craftsmen could technically afford noble foods, the legal restrictions kept those markets small and exclusive. Medieval tax records studied by historian Richard Britnell show that food restrictions actually increased economic inequality by preventing social mobility through consumption. In modern societies, successful people can fake it till they make it by adopting the consumption patterns of higher social classes. Medieval laws made this impossible, trapping people in their birth classes regardless of their economic success. Here's a detail that really captures the absurdity of this system. Medieval authorities were so paranoid about food-based social climbing that they regulated the spices people could use in their cooking. There were laws limiting which spices peasants could purchase, which spices merchants could use, and which spices were reserved exclusively for nobility. Your seasoning choices were literally a matter of law enforcement. The enforcement mechanisms for food laws were incredibly sophisticated. Medieval cities employed official food wardens who had the authority to enter private homes during mealtimes to inspect what was being served. These weren't casual inspections. They were systematic surveillance operations designed to catch people violating food laws in the privacy of their own homes. Court records from medieval London, preserved in the city archives, document hundreds of cases where families were prosecuted for food violations. The penalties range from fines to public humiliation to permanent exclusion from guilds or trades. Medieval authorities understood that controlling food was so important to maintaining social order that they were willing to invade people's privacy to enforce food laws. But here's what's most remarkable about this system. It actually worked for centuries. Medieval people internalized these food restrictions so completely that many people policed themselves and their neighbors. There are records of people reporting their own family members for food violations, believing that maintaining the social order was more important than family loyalty. Food historian Paul Friedman found evidence that medieval food restrictions were so psychologically effective that they persisted even when they weren't actively enforced. People continued to follow class-based eating restrictions out of habit and social conditioning, even in situations where no one was watching or checking. Think about the psychological power of a system that could make people voluntarily limit their own access to pleasure and nutrition based on artificial social categories. Medieval authorities had created a form of social control that was so internalized that it essentially ran itself, maintained by the victims of the system themselves. The legacy of medieval food-based social control extended far beyond the Middle Ages. Many of the dining etiquette rules, food preferences, and social eating customs that we still follow today can be traced directly back to medieval systems designed to reinforce class hierarchies. Every time we worry about using the right fork or serving the appropriate wine, we're participating in social traditions that were originally designed to keep people in their place. But as powerful as these systems of food-based social control were, they couldn't completely suppress the human desire for flavor, pleasure, and culinary creativity. And that tension between official food restrictions and people's natural desires led to the development of an underground food culture that was far more rebellious and revolutionary than medieval authorities ever imagined. Underneath all these oppressive food laws and social restrictions, something extraordinary was happening that medieval authorities couldn't control. Religion was completely revolutionizing how people thought about food, eating, and their relationship with God. And I'm not talking about simple blessing before meals here. I'm talking about religious eating rules so complex, so all-encompassing, and sometimes so bizarre that they make modern dietary restrictions look like child's play. Medieval people lived in a world where every single bite of food carried profound spiritual significance. What you ate, when you ate it, how you prepared it, and even who you ate it with could determine whether your soul went to heaven or hell. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was a direct line of communication with the divine, and getting it wrong could have eternal consequences. Let me start with something that will absolutely blow your mind. Medieval Catholics spent almost half the year fasting. Not the kind of casual intermittent fasting that's trendy today. I'm talking about strict religious fasting that was enforced by church law and monitored by religious authorities. Dr. Caroline Walker Bynum, who wrote the definitive study Holy Feast and Holy Fast, calculated that medieval Christians observed approximately 180 fast days per year. Here's what medieval fasting actually looked like. During Lent, Advent, and various other religious periods, people were forbidden from eating meat, dairy, eggs, or any animal products. They could eat only one full meal per day, usually in the evening. They couldn't eat anything before noon. And violations weren't just social embarrassments. They were considered serious sins that required confession and penance. But the complexity of medieval religious eating rules goes far beyond simple fasting. Medieval people had to navigate an incredibly intricate system of food taboos that changed based on the day of the week, the season, the liturgical calendar, and even their personal spiritual status. The Decretum Gratiani, a 12th century collection of church law compiled by the monk Gratian, includes hundreds of pages of detailed food regulations that were considered binding on all Christians. Here's something that perfectly captures how seriously medieval people took religious eating rules. Friday fish consumption wasn't just a casual tradition, it was law. Medieval authorities actually appointed official fish wardens in coastal communities, whose job was to ensure that fresh fish was available every Friday, so that Christians could properly observe the weekly fast from meat. There are surviving account books from medieval English ports showing massive government investments in fishing infrastructure, specifically to support religious dietary requirements. Medieval Jewish communities faced even more complex dietary challenges. Living as minorities in predominantly Christian societies, medieval Jews had to maintain kosher dietary laws while navigating Christian food regulations and social pressures. Food historian Susan Einbinder found evidence that medieval Jewish communities developed incredibly sophisticated systems for kosher food production that were often more technologically advanced than Christian food processing. The Sefer Hasidim, a 13th century Jewish ethical text, includes detailed guidance on how to maintain kosher eating while living in Christian societies. Medieval Jews had to deal with situations like, what do you do if a Christian lord invites you to a feast where refusing to eat would be politically dangerous? How do you maintain kosher laws when travelling through regions where kosher food isn't available? How do you handle business relationships that involve food when your dietary laws are completely different from your neighbours? But here's where medieval religious eating gets really fascinating. Different religious communities living in the same cities developed completely parallel food economies. Medieval Cordoba, studied extensively by historian Maria Rosa Menocal, had separate Christian, Jewish and Muslim food production systems that operated simultaneously in the same urban space, each following completely different religious regulations. Medieval Muslims in Christian territories faced their own unique challenges maintaining halal dietary laws. The Kitab al-Tabiq, a medieval Islamic cookbook, includes recipes specifically adapted for Muslims living in non-Muslim societies, showing how Islamic food culture adapted to European ingredients and cooking methods while maintaining religious requirements. Here's something that would absolutely amaze modern multi-faith communities. Medieval religious communities found ways to accommodate each other's dietary restrictions that were remarkably sophisticated. There are documented cases of medieval Christian nobles hosting Jewish merchants with completely kosher meals, and Muslim traders being served halal food at Christian monasteries. Medieval people understood that respecting dietary laws was essential for maintaining trade relationships and political alliances, but the most extreme religious eating practices belonged to medieval Christian monastics, who developed fasting and dietary restriction systems that were so severe they sometimes bordered on self-torture. The regula Sancti Benedicti, the rule of St. Benedict that governed monastic life, included food restrictions that make modern extreme dieting look moderate by comparison. Medieval monks and nuns often ate only once per day, never consumed meat, except when seriously ill, and observed additional fasting periods that could last for weeks. But here's what's really remarkable. They developed these restrictions not as punishment, but as spiritual technology, ways of using food control to achieve mystical experiences and closer communion with God. Food historian Caroline Bynum documented cases of medieval religious women who used extreme fasting as a form of spiritual empowerment. These weren't eating disorders in the modern sense. They were carefully controlled spiritual practices that gave women in medieval society a form of religious authority that was otherwise denied to them. Some medieval female mystics like Catherine of Siena became famous throughout Europe specifically because of their miraculous fasting abilities. But medieval religious eating wasn't all about restriction and fasting. Religious feast days created some of the most elaborate and joyful food celebrations in medieval culture. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and hundreds of saints' days were marked by special foods, elaborate meals, and community celebrations that brought entire communities together around shared religious and culinary traditions. The Liber de Coquina, a medieval cookbook from the papal court, includes recipes for religious feast foods that were incredibly elaborate and expensive. We're talking about dishes that required days of preparation, exotic ingredients imported from across the known world, and cooking techniques that were more art than sustenance. Religious feast foods were some of the most sophisticated cuisine of the medieval period. Here's something that really drives home how central food was to medieval religious life. Many of the foods we still associate with specific holidays, Easter eggs, Christmas cookies, Lenten fish dishes, were developed by medieval Christians as ways of marking religious time through eating. Medieval people essentially created a calendar of flavours that connected their daily meals to their spiritual lives throughout the year. Medieval pilgrimage culture created an entire international food network that was designed around religious eating requirements. Pilgrims travelling to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem needed places to eat that would respect their religious dietary requirements, while providing nutrition for long journeys on foot. Medieval monasteries developed standardized pilgrimage menus that could feed thousands of religious travelers while maintaining appropriate spiritual observances. The economic impact of religious eating rules was enormous. Medieval food production, distribution and processing were all organized around religious calendar requirements. Fish markets had to gear up for Lenten Fridays. Meat production had to account for fasting periods. Dairy processing had to adapt to religious restrictions. The entire medieval food economy was essentially designed around religious eating requirements. But perhaps the most profound impact of medieval religious eating was psychological and social. Religious food rules created shared community experiences that bonded people together across class lines. A peasant and a noble might eat completely different foods most of the time, but during religious fasting periods, they were following the same restrictions and sharing the same spiritual experiences. Medieval religious eating also created a form of social equality that was otherwise rare in medieval society. During religious fasting periods, everyone, from kings to peasants, was theoretically following the same dietary restrictions. Religious food rules were some of the few medieval laws that applied equally to all social classes. Think about the psychological impact of living in a world where your daily food choices were constantly connected to your spiritual life, your community identity, and your relationship with the divine. Medieval people experienced eating as a fundamentally sacred act in ways that most modern people have completely lost touch with. Can you imagine living in a world where every meal was a form of prayer, where your food choices were a daily expression of your deepest beliefs, where eating was never just about nutrition, but always about your soul's relationship with God? That was the reality for medieval people across all religious traditions. But as complex and spiritually meaningful as these religious eating systems were, they were about to be completely revolutionized by technological changes that would transform not just how medieval people ate, but how food itself could be produced, processed, and distributed on scales that had never been imagined before. Right in the middle of all these complex religious food traditions, something happened that would change the course of human history forever. And it started with what seemed like simple improvements to medieval kitchens and food production that gradually snowballed into a full-scale revolution that transformed not just how people ate, but how entire civilizations could be organized, fed, and sustained. We're talking about what historians call the medieval kitchen revolution, a series of technological breakthroughs that happened between 1100 and 1500 that were so profound they literally made the modern world possible. And it all started with something as simple as a better way to grind grain. Let me take you to a moment in 1180 when a medieval engineer was standing by a river in France, watching water flow, and suddenly had an idea that would change everything. What if, instead of just grinding grain with simple water wheels, we could use water power to drive multiple machines simultaneously? What if we could create mechanical systems that could process food on scales that had never been imagined before? The result was the development of what food historian John Langdon calls proto-industrial food processing complexes, medieval facilities that were essentially the first food factories in human history. The Barbegal Mill complex near Arles, France, studied extensively by archaeologist Kevin Green, included 16 interconnected water wheels that could process enough grain to feed 80,000 people per day. Think about that for a moment. In the year 1200, medieval engineers had created food processing facilities that could feed entire cities. They had figured out how to use renewable energy to power mechanical systems that produced food on industrial scales, centuries before anyone had conceived of the Industrial Revolution. But the real breakthrough came when medieval engineers started applying water and wind power to other aspects of food production. They created mechanical systems for pressing oil from olives and nuts, machines for crushing malt for brewing, devices for churning butter, and even early forms of mechanical meat processing. Food historian Lynn White Jr. documented over 30 different types of food processing machinery that were powered by water or windmills in medieval Europe. Here's where this gets really exciting. Medieval people were essentially creating the first mechanized food supply chains in human history. Raw grain could go into one end of a medieval mill complex and come out the other end as finished bread, with every step of the process, grinding, sifting, mixing, and even baking, powered by mechanical systems. The economic impact of this mechanization was staggering. Agricultural historian Georges Duby calculated that medieval mill technology increased food processing efficiency by a factor of 40 compared to hand processing. Suddenly, the same amount of human labour could feed vastly larger populations. This wasn't just technological progress, it was the foundation that made medieval population growth and urbanisation possible. But perhaps the most revolutionary medieval food innovation was something that would completely transform global trade and exploration. Advanced food preservation techniques that could keep provisions edible for months or even years without refrigeration. Medieval people developed these techniques out of necessity, but they accidentally created the technology that would make global exploration and trade possible. Medieval shipbuilders and provisioners, working together with food preservation specialists, created supply systems that could sustain long-distance voyages that had never been attempted before. The techniques they developed for preserving meat, fish, grains, and even fresh water for sea voyages were so advanced that they weren't significantly improved until the development of modern canning and refrigeration. Food historian Magellan Toussaint Samé found evidence that medieval preservation techniques could keep certain foods edible for over 2 years without any form of artificial preservation. We're talking about salt-cured meats, fermented grain products, and dried fruits that could sustain crews on voyages across entire oceans. Here's something that completely changed my understanding of medieval technology. The preservation techniques medieval people developed for long sea voyages were more sophisticated than the food preservation methods used by most armies until World War II. Medieval ship provisioners had solved problems that military logistics experts struggled with for centuries afterward. The development of improved transportation technology, Better roads, more efficient carts, enhanced river navigation, created food distribution networks that could move provisions across vast distances more quickly and efficiently than ever before. Medieval Europe developed what economist Fernand Braudel calls the first continental food market, a trade network that could move surplus food from productive regions to areas experiencing shortages. This meant that local famines, which had devastated communities throughout early medieval history, became much less common. When crops failed in one region, food could be transported from areas with surplus production. Medieval people had essentially created the first disaster relief food distribution systems in European history, but the innovation that might have had the biggest impact on world history was medieval improvements in navigation and shipbuilding that made long-distance exploration possible. And here's the connection that most people don't realize. These technological advances were directly driven by the need to find better, more reliable sources of food, especially spices and other high-value food items. The astronomical cost of spices in medieval Europe, remember pepper was worth more than gold, created enormous economic incentives for finding alternative trade routes to Asia. Medieval Europeans were essentially willing to risk their lives sailing off the edge of the known world because the potential profits from direct spice trade were so enormous. Christopher Columbus, when he pitched his voyage to Queen Isabella, wasn't primarily talking about discovering new lands. He was talking about finding a direct route to the spice markets of Asia that would bypass all the expensive middlemen who were making spices so costly in Europe. The discovery of America happened because medieval Europeans were obsessed with better access to food. Think about the chain of causation here. Medieval food preservation techniques made long sea voyages possible. Medieval spice economics created the financial incentives for those voyages. Medieval navigation and shipbuilding technology made the voyages feasible. The result was the discovery of the New World and the beginning of the first truly global economy. But the technological revolution that really transformed medieval food culture was the development of standardized measurements, weights, and recipes that made large-scale food production possible. Medieval guild systems, studied extensively by historian James Davis, created the first standardized food production methods in European history. Medieval bakers, brewers, and food processors developed precise measurement systems, quality control standards, and reproducible techniques that allowed them to produce consistent products on larger scales than had ever been attempted. The assize of bread in England created standardized weights and measures that were enforced across the entire kingdom. Medieval people were essentially creating the first industrial food standards. This standardization had profound social and economic effects. For the first time in European history, someone could travel from one city to another and expect to find bread, ale, and other basic foods that met consistent quality standards. Trade became more efficient because merchants could rely on standardized products. Urban populations could grow because food supply became more predictable and reliable. Medieval innovations in food storage and distribution also revolutionized urban planning. Cities could be built larger and denser because improved food preservation and transportation meant that urban populations didn't have to depend entirely on local food production. Medieval engineers developed granaries, warehouses, and food distribution systems that could sustain cities with populations that would have been impossible in earlier periods. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the medieval kitchen revolution was how it democratized access to better food. Technological improvements in food processing and preservation meant that foods that had previously been available only to the wealthy became accessible to broader populations. Mechanical grain processing made bread more affordable. Improved brewing techniques made beer safer and more consistent. Better preservation methods made nutritious foods available year-round. The ripple effects of medieval food technology innovation are still with us today. Every time you eat processed food, every time you consume something that's been mechanically ground or mixed, every time you eat preserved food that was made in a factory, you're benefiting from technological innovations that were first developed by medieval engineers and food processors. Medieval people had essentially created the technological foundation for modern food production without having any idea what they were building toward. They were solving immediate practical problems: how to feed growing populations, how to make food safer, how to preserve food for longer periods. But their solutions created the basis for the entire modern food system. But as revolutionary as these technological changes were, they paled in comparison to what happened when medieval people encountered foods from other parts of the world that they had never imagined existed. Because that's when medieval cuisine didn't just evolve, it exploded into something completely unrecognizable from what had come before. Imagine being a medieval European who had never seen anything more exotic than an apple, and suddenly someone hands you a bright red tomato and tells you it's food. Your first instinct would probably be to run away screaming, because this thing looks like it's been dipped in blood and might actually be poisonous, which ironically is exactly what medieval Europeans thought when they first encountered foods that would later become absolutely central to their cuisine. Medieval people lived in a world where food was medicine, medicine was food, and the line between healing and poisoning was terrifyingly thin. So when they started encountering completely alien foods from other parts of the world, they didn't just think, oh, something new to eat. They thought, is this going to cure me or kill me? And their approach to answering that question was both brilliantly scientific and absolutely bonkers at the same time. Let me tell you about the medieval encounter with what they called the doctrine of new foods, their systematic approach to figuring out whether unfamiliar foods were safe, beneficial, or deadly. Medieval physicians developed elaborate testing protocols that combined ancient Greek medical theory, Islamic scientific methods, Christian theological principles, and a healthy dose of trial and error using human test subjects. The process started with something called signature analysis, examining new foods for visual clues about their medicinal properties. Dr. Jerry Stannard, who studied medieval pharmaceutical texts at the University of Kansas, found evidence that medieval physicians would spend days analyzing the color, shape, texture, and smell of new foods to determine their potential effects on human health. Here's how this actually worked. When European traders first brought sugar cane back from the Middle East, medieval physicians noticed that it was white and crystalline, similar to salt, but it was sweet instead of salty, which according to medieval medical theory meant it had warming rather than cooling properties. They concluded that sugar must be a powerful medicine that could treat cold diseases like depression and fatigue. Medieval people weren't wrong about sugar being powerful. They just didn't understand that it was powerful in ways that would eventually contribute to diabetes, obesity, and tooth decay. But their systematic approach to analysing new foods was remarkably sophisticated, even though their underlying theories were completely incorrect. The really wild part was the human testing phase. Medieval physicians would start by having food tasters, usually servants or volunteers, consume tiny amounts of new foods while being carefully monitored for any adverse reactions. Food historian Paul Friedman found evidence that medieval courts employed professional food testers whose job was essentially to be human guinea pigs for exotic new ingredients. These weren't casual taste tests. Medieval food testers followed elaborate protocols that could take weeks or months. They would start with amounts so small they were barely detectable, gradually increasing the dose while monitoring for everything from digestive upset to changes in mood, sleep patterns, and even dreams. Medieval people believed that foods could affect your spiritual state. so they were watching for signs that new foods might be influencing the soul as well as the body. Here's something that completely changed my understanding of medieval food culture. When European explorers started bringing back foods from the Americas, medieval people initially rejected most of them as potentially dangerous. Tomatoes, potatoes, corn, chocolate, vanilla, peppers, foods that we now consider essential parts of European cuisine, were viewed with suspicion and fear for decades or even centuries. Medieval Europeans called tomatoes poison apples and refused to eat them for over 200 years after they were first introduced. They thought potatoes were fit only for animal feed and possibly caused leprosy. They believed that corn was nutritionally inferior to European grains and might cause mental illness. In many cases, they were partially right to be cautious, but for completely wrong reasons. The resistance to New World foods reveals something fascinating about medieval medical thinking. Medieval physicians had developed such sophisticated theories about how foods affected human health that they couldn't easily incorporate ingredients that didn't fit their existing categories. Tomatoes didn't look like any European food, so they couldn't be classified according to traditional hot, cold, wet, dry categories that formed the basis of medieval nutrition. But when medieval people did start accepting new foods, they transformed them in ways that were incredibly creative. Medieval cooks didn't just adopt new ingredients, they completely reimagined them according to European taste preferences and medical theories. The way medieval Europeans approached chocolate is a perfect example of this process. Aztec chocolate was consumed as a bitter, spicy drink often mixed with chili peppers and used primarily for religious ceremonies. When Spanish conquistadors brought cacao beans back to Europe, medieval cooks completely reinvented chocolate according to European tastes. They added sugar, vanilla, and eventually milk, transforming it from a bitter ceremonial drink into the sweet confection we know today. Food historian Sophie Coe documented this transformation process in incredible detail. Medieval European chocolate recipes from the 16th and 17th centuries show a complete cultural translation of an Aztec food into something that fit European palates and medical theories. Europeans believed that sweetness had healing properties, so they turned bitter chocolate into sweet chocolate specifically because they thought it would be more medicinally beneficial. The medieval approach to exotic spices was equally fascinating. When European traders started bringing back spices like vanilla, allspice, and various chili peppers from the Americas, medieval cooks didn't just use them as seasonings. They incorporated them into their existing medical and culinary systems in ways that created entirely new categories of food. Medieval physicians classified new spices according to their supposed effects on the four bodily humours, often assigning medicinal properties that had nothing to do with the spice's traditional uses in their cultures of origin. Vanilla, which was used primarily for flavouring in Aztec culture, was classified by medieval European physicians as a powerful aphrodisiac and treatment for mental illness. Here's something that shows just how sophisticated medieval food analysis could be. When European traders started importing tea from China, medieval physicians spent decades developing elaborate theories about tea's medicinal properties that were based on careful observation of its effects on human health. They noticed that tea consumption seemed to improve alertness and digestion, and they developed complex brewing protocols designed to maximize these beneficial effects. Medieval tea preparation involved precise temperature control, specific steeping times, and elaborate serving rituals that were designed not just for taste, but for optimal medicinal benefit. European tea culture, which we often think of as purely social, was originally developed as a form of medical treatment based on medieval theories about how foods could be used as medicine. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval food medicine was how it created the foundation for modern nutritional science. Medieval physicians were essentially conducting controlled experiments in human nutrition, carefully observing the effects of different foods on health, and developing theories about optimal diet that were surprisingly sophisticated. The Tarquinium Sanitatis, a medieval health manual based on Arabic medical knowledge, includes dietary recommendations that modern nutritionists would recognize as scientifically sound. Medieval physicians recommended eating a variety of foods from different categories, balancing different flavors and textures, and adjusting diet according to individual constitution and health needs. Medieval food medicine also created the first systematic approaches to treating diseases through dietary intervention. Medieval physicians developed specific meal plans for treating everything from depression to digestive disorders to skin conditions. They understood that food could be more powerful than herbal medicines for treating chronic health problems. Dr. Luc de Mate found evidence that medieval hospitals employed specialized diet masters, whose job was to design therapeutic meal plans for patients with different conditions. These weren't just general nutrition guidelines, they were personalized medical treatments that used food as the primary therapeutic intervention. Medieval people had essentially created the first evidence-based nutrition science, even though their underlying theories about how nutrition worked were often completely wrong. They were conducting systematic experiments in human diet and health centuries before the development of modern scientific methods. Think about the intellectual courage it took for medieval people to systematically test unknown foods on themselves, develop theories about how diet affected health, and create therapeutic eating protocols based on careful observation. They were essentially pioneering the entire field of nutritional medicine, using nothing but empirical observation and logical reasoning. But all of these remarkable innovations in food, cooking, nutrition, and medicine were leading up to something that medieval people themselves could never have anticipated. They were creating the foundation for a complete transformation in how human beings would relate to food, eating, and each other that would fundamentally reshape the entire course of human civilization. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden world of medieval food, I want to leave you with the most shocking revelation of all. Everything we've discovered about how medieval people ate, cooked, preserved, regulated, and revolutionized food is still shaping your life today in ways you've probably never imagined. Right now, as you're listening to this story, you're surrounded by the legacy of medieval food innovation. The bread you ate for breakfast? The technique for making it was perfected by medieval bakers who faced execution for getting the recipe wrong. The spices in your kitchen cabinet? They're there because medieval people were willing to sail off the edge of the known world to find them. The restaurant you ate at last week? It exists because medieval people invented the concept of commercial food service. But here's what really gets to me, and what I think is the most profound lesson from this entire story. Medieval people, despite having access to far fewer resources than we do, despite lacking all of our scientific knowledge, despite facing constant threats of starvation and food poisoning, somehow managed to create a relationship with food that was deeper, more meaningful, and more sustainable than what most of us have today. Medieval people understood something that we've largely forgotten, that food is never just about nutrition. Food is about community, identity, spirituality, creativity, and our fundamental connection to the natural world. Every meal was an opportunity for gratitude. Every shared dish was a bond between people. Every recipe was a link to ancestors and a gift to future generations. Think about the last time you ate a meal with the kind of mindfulness that medieval people brought to every bite. When did you last feel genuine gratitude for the complex chain of human labor, natural processes, and historical innovations that brought food to your plate? When did you last share a meal that strengthened your connections to your community in the way that medieval food culture automatically did? Here's something that absolutely amazes me. Despite all our modern advantages, global food distribution, scientific nutrition knowledge, food safety regulations, refrigeration, mechanical processing, we've managed to create food problems that medieval people never had to deal with. We have epidemics of diet-related diseases, environmental destruction from industrial agriculture, social isolation around eating, and a complete disconnection from the sources of our food. Medieval people, for all their limitations, had solved problems that we're still struggling with. They had created circular food systems where nothing was wasted. They had developed community food networks that ensured no one went hungry when resources were available. They had established eating practices that connected people to their environment, their neighbours, and their spiritual lives. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval people had created a food culture that was simultaneously local and global. They ate primarily local ingredients prepared according to traditional methods, but they also participated in international trade networks that brought exotic spices and new cooking techniques from across the known world. They had achieved something that we're still trying to figure out: how to be globally connected while remaining locally rooted. The innovations that medieval people developed out of necessity, fermentation techniques, preservation methods, seasonal eating, minimal waste, community food sharing, are exactly the solutions that modern food experts are promoting as cutting-edge approaches to sustainable eating. Medieval people were doing regenerative agriculture, farm-to-table dining, and community-supported food systems centuries before these became trendy modern movements. Here's what I find most inspiring about medieval food culture. These people faced challenges that were far more severe than anything we deal with today. Yet they responded with creativity, ingenuity, and community cooperation that produced remarkable innovations. They turned scarcity into abundance through clever preservation techniques. They transformed simple ingredients into complex flavors through skillful cooking. They created celebration and joy around food even when resources were limited. Medieval people proved that human beings are capable of creating food cultures that are simultaneously practical and beautiful, efficient and meaningful, local and cosmopolitan. They show us that some of our modern food problems aren't inevitable consequences of civilization. They're choices we've made that we could choose to change. The next time you sit down to eat, I want you to remember the medieval baker who risked his life to perfect the bread you're enjoying. Remember the medieval spice trader who travelled thousands of dangerous miles to bring flavour to your meal. Remember the medieval cook who developed the fermentation technique that created the cheese you're eating. Remember the medieval farmer who carefully saved seeds through harsh winters to ensure that the grains in your meal would survive for future generations. Food is never just food. Every bite you take connects you to thousands of years of human innovation, creativity and cooperation. Every meal is an opportunity to participate in the great human project of turning the raw materials of nature into nourishment, pleasure, and community bonds. Medieval people understood this intuitively. They knew that eating was one of the most fundamentally human activities, and they approached it with the seriousness, creativity, and reverence that such an important activity deserves. As we close this remarkable journey through the hidden world of medieval food, I want to thank you for taking this adventure with me through time. We've discovered together that history is never just about the past. It's about understanding the present and imagining better possibilities for the future. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story about human resilience, creativity, and the power of community to solve seemingly impossible problems. It's a reminder that our ancestors were far more ingenious and sophisticated than we often give them credit for, and that we have much to learn from their wisdom. So the next time someone tells you that medieval people lived in the Dark Ages, you can smile and remember what you now know. These were people who created some of the most innovative, sustainable, and meaningful food cultures in human history. They may not have had our technology, but they had something equally valuable, a deep understanding of what it means to be human and how food connects us to each other and to the world around us. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the hidden world of medieval food. There are so many more fascinating stories from history waiting to be discovered, so many more secrets from the past that can illuminate our present and inspire our future. Sweet dreams, and remember, every time you eat, you're participating in a story that stretches back thousands of years and connects you to every human being who has ever shared a meal, broken bread with a friend, or gathered around a table in gratitude for the incredible gift of nourishment.